Robert felt a strange mixture of emotions washing over him. Relief that his children were safe and happy, curiosity about what story could possibly be interesting enough to hold their attention like this, confusion about who this man was and how he'd ended up in their living room. And underneath it all, a growing sense that whatever was happening here was important in a way he didn't yet understand. The man looked up from the documents and smiled at something Tommy said. It was the kind of smile that reached his eyes, the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed being around children. Robert found himself relaxing slightly. Whatever else was going on, this man clearly cared about his kid's experience. But then the man said something that made Robert's blood run cold. He couldn't hear all the words, but he distinctly caught "your great-great-grandfather" and what sounded like slavery and schools. Robert's mind went blank. Great-great-grandfather? Slavery? What was this man talking about? Robert knew his family history. His great-great-grandfather had been a European merchant who came to America in the 1800s and built a successful trading business. There had never been any mention of slavery or schools or anything like what this man seemed to be discussing. Fear and confusion crashed over him in waves. Was this man filling his children's heads with made-up stories? Was he some kind of scam artist who somehow knew personal information about their family? Or worse, was he telling them things that were true, things that Robert himself had never been told? As he stood there in his own hallway, feeling like a stranger in his own home, Robert realized that whatever happened next would change everything. His comfortable, predictable life had just taken a turn into completely unknown territory. And his children, sitting on his expensive Persian rug and listening to stories about ancestors he'd never heard of, seemed to be loving every minute of it. Robert stood frozen behind the kitchen doorway, his heart pounding so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. The sounds coming from his living room made absolutely no sense. Where were the video games? Where was the TV blaring cartoons? Instead, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the gentle voice of an old man telling stories. He took a careful step forward, staying in the shadows. His expensive Italian leather shoes made no sound on the marble floor as he crept closer to see what was happening in his own home. What he saw next made his world stop spinning. The living room looked completely different. Gone was the perfect arrangement his wife had spent hours creating. The white leather sofa was pushed to one side. The glass coffee table that cost more than most people's cars was now covered with old papers, faded photographs, and what looked like ancient documents. His Persian rug, worth $50,000, had two 8-year-old children sitting cross-legged on it like they were at some kind of camp. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was seeing his twins, usually glued to their tablets or fighting over toys, sitting completely still and hanging on every word of a story being told by the elderly man he barely knew. The man, Samuel, he remembered now, was holding up an old photograph. Even from where Robert stood hiding, he could see it was one of those sepia-colored pictures from long ago, the kind you see in museums or history books. Samuel's weathered hands held it carefully, like it was made of gold. "This here," Samuel said in a voice that carried decades of wisdom, "is your great-great-grandfather. His name was William, and he was one of the bravest men who ever lived." Robert's throat went dry. Great-great-grandfather? What was this man talking about? And why did he have old family photographs that Robert had never seen before? His daughter Lucy leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What made him so brave, Mr. Samuel?" Robert watched his son Tommy scoot closer too, both children completely captivated by whatever story was unfolding. These were the same kids who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes during dinner, now hanging on every word like their lives depended on it. Samuel smiled, the kind of smile that held 1,000 memories. "Well, children, your great-great-grandfather William was born in a time when things were very different in our country. He was born in 1840, when some people weren't allowed to learn how to read or write. Can you imagine that? That's impossible," Tommy burst out. "Everyone learns to read?" "Not back then, son," Samuel said gently. "William was born into slavery. Do you know what that means?" Robert felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Slavery? What was this man telling his children? His hands started shaking as he gripped the doorframe tighter. Lucy raised her small hand like she was in school. I learned about slavery in history class. It was when people were forced to work without being paid, right? That's right, sweetheart. And William was one of those people. But here's the amazing part. Even though it was dangerous, even though he could get in terrible trouble for it, William learned to read and write anyway. He did it in secret, late at night when no one was watching. Samuel reached into a worn leather bag beside him and pulled out what looked like an old book. The pages were yellow with age, and the cover was held together with tape. This, he said reverently, was William's first book. He wrote it himself, teaching other people the letters and words he had learned. Robert's mind was racing. This couldn't be real. His family history was well documented. His grandfather had told him they came from successful European merchants. There had never been any mention of slavery or anything like what this man was describing. But then Samuel pulled out another photograph, and Robert's blood turned to ice. It was clearly old, probably from the 1890s based on the clothing and style. But the man in the photograph, Robert had seen that face before. Not exactly the same, but similar enough that it was unmistakable. The same strong jawline that Robert saw in the mirror every morning. The same deep-set eyes that people always complimented him on. The same proud way of standing that Robert had inherited and never questioned. After slavery ended, Samuel continued, William didn't just celebrate his freedom. He decided to use it to help others. He started the very first school for freed slaves right here in this county. Here? Lucy gasped. Like right here where we live? Right here where you live, darling. In fact, the building is still standing. It's that old brick building downtown that your daddy probably drives past every day on his way to work. Robert knew exactly which building Samuel meant. It was the one with the historical marker that he'd never bothered to read. The one that had been turned into a community center that he'd driven past 1,000 times without a second thought. Samuel pulled out more photographs. Pictures of a young William standing in front of a small wooden building with children of all ages gathered around him. Pictures of him shaking hands with important-looking men in suits. Pictures of him receiving what looked like official documents. The government gave William land grants, Samuel explained, because his school was so successful. He used that land to start other schools and then other businesses. He was what people today would call an entrepreneur. Tommy's eyes lit up. Like Daddy. Daddy's an entrepreneur too. Robert felt sick. His business empire, his wealth, his success, he'd always believed it came from his own hard work and smart decisions. He'd told everyone, including his children, that his family had built their fortune through wise investments and good business sense. He'd never mentioned anything about land grants or schools for freed slaves because he'd never known about any of it. But there was something else bothering him, something that made his stomach twist into knots. Samuel wasn't just randomly sharing these stories. He seemed to know exactly what he was talking about. He handled those photographs like they were precious family heirlooms. He spoke about William like he'd known him personally. Mr. Samuel, Lucy asked innocently, how do you know so much about our great-great-grandfather? Samuel's eyes grew soft, and for a moment, he looked like he was seeing something far away. Well, sweetheart, that's a story for another time. But I will tell you this. Your great-great-grandfather William was a very special man. And that specialness runs in your family. He looked directly at the children, his voice becoming more serious. You see, children, your daddy has that same strength inside him. That same intelligence and determination that made William so successful. But sometimes, people forget where their real power comes from. Robert's heart was hammering now. There was something in the way Samuel said your daddy that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Much more. Samuel reached into his bag again and pulled out what looked like old letters tied together with a faded ribbon. These are letters that William wrote to his children and grandchildren. Letters about the importance of remembering where you come from and never being ashamed of your heritage. What's heritage? Tommy asked. Heritage is your family history, son. It's all the people who came before you and all the things they did that made it possible for you to be here today. It's like a chain that connects you to everyone in your family who lived before you were born. Lucy nodded thoughtfully. So William is part of our heritage? William is a very important part of your heritage, darling. And there's so much more to learn about him and all the other amazing people in your family. Robert realized he was holding his breath. Everything Samuel was saying contradicted everything he'd believed about his family. But those photographs, those documents, they looked genuine. And there was something about the way Samuel spoke that suggested he wasn't making any of this up. Samuel carefully placed one of the letters in Lucy's small hands. "Can you read what it says at the top?" Lucy squinted at the old-fashioned handwriting. "To my descendants," Samuel helped gently. "That means the people who come after you and your family? Your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren." "Like us!" Tommy exclaimed. "Exactly like you," Samuel smiled. "William wrote this letter specifically for children like you, who would be born long after he was gone. He wanted to make sure you knew about him and felt proud of what he accomplished." As Robert watched his children handle these mysterious family artifacts with reverence and excitement, he realized that everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, about his place in the world, was about to change forever. And the man sitting on his expensive rug, surrounded by his children and these impossible documents, held all the answers to questions Robert had never even thought to ask. Samuel carefully unfolded another document, this one looking even older than the photographs. The paper was so delicate that Robert could see him handling it like it might crumble at any moment. The children leaned in closer, their faces glowing with curiosity. "Now this here is something very special," Samuel said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "This is the original deed to the land that William received from the government. Look at this date, 1867. That's just 2 years after slavery ended." Lucy traced her finger in the air above the faded ink, afraid to actually touch it. "What's a deed, Mr. Samuel?" "A deed is like a certificate that proves you own something. In this case, it proved that William owned 200 acres of land. That might not sound like much today, but back then, it was more land than most people could ever dream of owning." Robert's legs felt weak. 200 acres. In 1867? He did a quick calculation in his head. That land, if it was anywhere near where they lived now, would be worth millions today. Maybe tens of millions. Samuel reached for another photograph, this one showing a larger building made of brick. William didn't just start one school, children. He was so successful that within 10 years, he had built 5 different schools across 3 counties. 5 schools? Tommy's eyes were huge. By himself? Well, not completely by himself, Samuel chuckled. He had help from some very special people, including your great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth. He showed them a photograph of a beautiful woman in Victorian dress standing beside William. She had kind eyes and a confident smile that somehow looked familiar to Robert, though he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. Elizabeth was a teacher, too, but she was also what people called a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Do you know what that was? Both children shook their heads, completely captivated. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually a railroad with trains. It was a secret network of people who helped slaves escape to freedom. It was very dangerous work. If Elizabeth got caught, she could have been put in prison or worse. Robert found himself leaning forward despite his shock. He'd never heard any of these stories before. Not from his father, not from his grandfather, not from anyone in his family. Samuel pulled out what looked like a small leather journal. This belonged to Elizabeth. She wrote down the names of every person she helped escape. Over 300 people found freedom because of her courage. 300 people! Lucy gasped. That's like our whole school. More than your whole school, sweetheart. And each one of those people went on to have children and grandchildren, just like William and Elizabeth did. Just like your daddy did with you. Samuel's eyes found the doorway where Robert was hiding, and for just a moment, Robert could have sworn the old man looked directly at him. But then Samuel turned back to the children as if nothing had happened. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting, Samuel continued, opening the leather journal carefully. After William and Elizabeth built their schools, something unexpected happened. The schools became so successful that important people from the government started paying attention. He showed them a letter with an official-looking seal at the top. This is a letter from the governor of the state, asking William to help start schools in other parts of the country. They wanted him to travel to places like Alabama and Mississippi to teach other people how to build schools for freed slaves. Tommy raised his hand like he was in class. Did he go? He did indeed. William and Elizabeth spent 5 years traveling all over the South, helping communities start their own schools. And everywhere they went, they were given more land as payment for their work. Robert's mind was reeling. More land? How much land had his family owned? And what had happened to it all? As if reading his thoughts, Samuel pulled out a map. It was hand-drawn and looked very old, but Robert could make out familiar landmarks. There was the river that ran through their town. There was the hill where the old courthouse stood. And scattered across the map were little squares with WW written inside them. Each one of these squares represents land that William owned, Samuel explained. By 1875, your great-great-grandfather owned over 1,000 acres spread across 4 different counties. 1,000 acres? Lucy tried to imagine it. That's bigger than our whole neighborhood. Much bigger than your neighborhood, darling. And William was smart about what he did with that land. He didn't just keep it for himself. Samuel showed them another document, this one with multiple signatures at the bottom. William divided up some of his land and gave it to the families of his former students. He wanted to make sure that other people had the same opportunities he'd been given. That was really nice of him, Tommy said. It was more than nice, son. It was revolutionary. You see, William understood something that not many people understood back then. He knew that education and opportunity had to go hand in hand. You couldn't just teach people to read if they didn't have a way to use that education to build better lives. Robert was struggling to process everything he was hearing. This wasn't just family history, this was American history. Important history that somehow, inexplicably, his family had been part of. But why had he never heard any of it before? Samuel seemed to sense the questions hanging in the air. He pulled out a photograph that made Robert's heart skip a beat. It showed a young man who looked remarkably like Robert's own father, standing in front of what was clearly a more modern building. "This is your great-grandfather, Robert," Samuel said gently. "William's grandson." His name was James, and he continued the family tradition of education. He turned his grandfather's schools into what became the first community college in this region. "A whole college!" Lucy's voice was full of wonder. "A whole college, and it's still there today, though it's much bigger now. In fact, it's where I used to work before I retired." Robert felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The community college? He knew that college. He'd driven past it hundreds of times. His wife had even taken some art classes there. How was it possible that his family had founded it and he'd never known? Samuel reached into his bag one more time and pulled out something that made Robert's blood freeze. It was a more recent photograph, probably from the 1940s or 1950s, showing a woman Robert recognized immediately. It was his grandmother, Ruth, but she looked different somehow. Younger, happier, and standing next to a sign that read, "Wellington Community Education Center." "This is your grandmother, Ruth," Samuel said softly. "She was a remarkable woman. She taught at the community college for 30 years and helped hundreds of students get their education." "We remember Grandma Ruth," Tommy exclaimed. "She used to make us cookies and tell us stories." "That's right," Samuel smiled. "And your Grandma Ruth was very proud of her family history. She used to talk about William and Elizabeth all the time." Robert's head was spinning. Grandma Ruth had known all of this. She'd known about William and Elizabeth and the schools and the land, and she'd never said anything to him about it. But then Samuel's expression grew sadder. "Unfortunately, not everyone in your family felt the same way about this history. Your grandfather, Ruth's husband, he felt differently." Samuel pulled out a newspaper clipping from what looked like the 1960s. The headline read, "Local College Founders' Heritage Questioned." You see, children, there was a time in our country when being connected to slavery, even as someone who had overcome it and achieved great things, was seen as shameful by some people. Your grandfather was worried that if people knew about William and Elizabeth, it might hurt the family's reputation. "But why?" Lucy asked, confused. "William and Elizabeth sound amazing." "They were amazing, sweetheart. But sometimes fear makes people do things that don't make sense. Your grandfather convinced your father to stop talking about this part of the family history. He wanted people to think the family wealth came from European merchants instead of American pioneers." Robert felt sick. His father had known all of this and had deliberately hidden it from him, had made up stories about European merchants to cover up the truth about William and Elizabeth. Samuel carefully put the newspaper clipping back in his bag. Your grandmother Ruth never agreed with that decision. She believed that William and Elizabeth's story was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. Before she passed away, she made me promise something very important. The old man's eyes grew misty as he looked at the children. She made me promise that if I ever got the chance, I would make sure you children learned the truth about your heritage. She said the family history was too important to stay buried forever. Tommy looked confused. But Mr. Samuel, how did you know Grandma Ruth? Samuel smiled, and Robert could see decades of memories dancing in his eyes. Well, son, that's because your Grandma Ruth was my teacher when I was a young man at the community college. And later, when I became a professor myself, she became my colleague and my dear friend. You were a professor? Lucy asked with surprise. I was indeed. I taught history at the very college that your great-grandfather James built, which was founded on the land that your great-great-grandfather William earned through his work in education. Robert realized his hands were shaking. This wasn't just some random man who happened to know family stories. This was someone who had been part of their family's life for decades, someone who had been trusted with their history by his own grandmother. Samuel gathered all the photographs and documents carefully, like he was putting precious treasures back in a safe place. Your daddy, he said to the children, his voice carrying a weight that made them listen carefully. He has the same intelligence and determination that made William so successful. The same caring heart that made Elizabeth risk her life to help others. The same dedication to building something meaningful that drove James to create the college. He paused and looked directly toward the doorway where Robert was hiding. But somewhere along the way, your family forgot where that strength really comes from. They forgot that their power comes from people who refused to be held back by circumstances, who turned obstacles into opportunities, who built something lasting for future generations. Lucy tilted her head thoughtfully. Mr. Samuel, if all of this is true, why doesn't Daddy know about it? Samuel's smile was sad but understanding. Sometimes, little one, the truth gets buried under fear and misunderstanding. But the beautiful thing about truth is that it has a way of coming back to light when the time is right. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking with age. And I think, he said, still looking toward the doorway, that the time might be right very soon. What kind of questions? Tommy asked. Robert looked around the room at all the evidence of a family history he'd never known existed. Questions like, what was William really like? What were his favorite foods? Did he tell jokes? What did Elizabeth think about when she was helping people escape slavery? Was she scared? Samuel's eyes lit up. Oh, Robert, I can answer some of those questions. Your grandmother told me so many stories over the years. William loved apple pie and terrible puns. Elizabeth kept a journal where she wrote about her fears and her hopes. They weren't just historical figures. They were real people with real personalities and quirks and dreams. For the first time since he'd stepped into the room, Robert felt something other than shock and confusion. He felt curious. He wanted to know more. Mr. Samuel, he said slowly, how much more of this story is there? Samuel smiled, the same warm smile that had captivated the children all afternoon. Robert, we've barely scratched the surface. Your family's story doesn't end with William and Elizabeth. It doesn't even end with your grandmother Ruth. It continues with you, and with these beautiful children, and with choices you get to make about what happens next. The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed the weight of that statement. Outside, Robert could hear the normal sounds of his neighborhood, cars driving by, neighbors talking, dogs barking. But inside his living room, surrounded by documents and photographs that proved his entire understanding of himself had been incomplete, everything felt different. Everything felt like it was just beginning. The silence in the room stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Robert sat on his sofa, holding his daughter Lucy, while his son Tommy leaned against his other side. Samuel remained in his chair, patiently waiting, surrounded by the photographs and documents that had turned Robert's world upside down. Finally, Lucy broke the silence. Daddy, can we see more pictures of William and Elizabeth? Robert looked down at his daughter's hopeful face, then across at Samuel. Something inside him shifted. Maybe it was seeing how excited his children were about their heritage. Maybe it was reading his grandmother's letter and understanding the burden she'd carried for so many years. Or maybe it was just exhaustion from trying to process so much shocking information at once. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I think I'd like to see more pictures too." Samuel's face broke into the widest smile Robert had seen from him all day. "I was hoping you'd say that." The old man reached into his leather bag and pulled out what looked like an entire photo album. It was thick and worn, with a cover that had clearly been handled countless times over the years. "This," Samuel said reverently, "belonged to your grandmother Ruth. She spent decades collecting every photograph, every document, every piece of family history she could find." He opened the album carefully, and Robert gasped. The first page contained baby pictures, old-fashioned portraits of infants in Victorian-era clothing, but unmistakably family photos. "These are William and Elizabeth's children," Samuel explained. "Your great-great-aunts and uncles. Ruth managed to track down descendants from all the different branches of the family tree." Tommy pointed to one of the baby pictures. "That baby looks just like Lucy did when she was little." "Family resemblance is a powerful thing," Samuel chuckled. "Wait until you see this." He turned to a page that made Robert's breath catch in his throat. It was a photograph from what looked like the 1920s, showing a large family gathering. There were probably 30 people in the picture, ranging from elderly grandparents to small children, all dressed in their Sunday best. This was taken at the 50th anniversary celebration of William's first school, Samuel explained. "Your great-grandfather James is right there in the front row." Robert leaned forward, studying the faces. There was something magical about seeing so many people who shared his features, his children's expressions, all gathered together to celebrate something his ancestor had built. "Look, Daddy!" Lucy pointed to a little girl in the photograph who couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. "She has the same curly hair that I have." "That's your great-great-aunt Margaret," Samuel said with a smile. According to Ruth, she grew up to become a nurse and worked in hospitals for 40 years. They spent the next hour going through page after page of the album. Samuel had a story for almost everyone in the photographs. There was Cousin Theodore, who became a lawyer and fought for civil rights. There was Aunt Josephine, who started a program to teach adults how to read. There was Uncle Charles, who served in both world wars and came home to start a construction company that built affordable housing. "Our family has been pretty busy," Tommy observed, making both Samuel and Robert laugh. "Very busy," Samuel agreed, "and very dedicated to helping other people." As they continued through the album, Robert began to see patterns. Almost everyone Samuel told them about had devoted their lives to education, community service, or helping others in some way. It wasn't just William and Elizabeth. It was generation after generation of people who seemed to believe that success meant lifting others up. "Mr. Samuel," Robert said slowly, "this is going to sound like a strange question, but why did my father really decide to hide all of this? I mean, looking at these pictures, reading these stories, this isn't something to be ashamed of. This is incredible." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "Your father grew up during some very difficult times, Robert. The 1940s and 50s were complicated years. There were people who believed that any connection to slavery, even as someone who had overcome it, was something that could be used against you." He pulled out a newspaper clipping from the 1960s. The headline made Robert wince. "Local business owners questionable. Heritage investigated." "This article was written about your grandfather's construction business," Samuel explained. "Some competitors were trying to discredit him by bringing up the family's connection to slavery. They twisted the story, made it sound like there was something shameful about William and Elizabeth's history." "That's terrible," Lucy said indignantly. "It was terrible, sweetheart. And it scared your grandfather badly. He'd worked so hard to build his business, and suddenly people were trying to tear it down because of his heritage." Robert understood now, so he decided it was safer to just erase that part of the family history. Exactly. He created the story about European merchants because he thought it would protect his children and grandchildren from facing the same kind of attacks. Tommy looked confused. "But Mr. Samuel, why would anyone think William and Elizabeth's story was bad?" "They helped people." Samuel sat back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, son, people's fear and prejudice can make them see things in a twisted way. They couldn't appreciate the courage and determination it took for William and Elizabeth to overcome slavery and build something beautiful. All they could see was the slavery part. "That's not fair," Lucy said firmly. "No, darling, it's not fair at all. But your grandfather was trying to protect his family the only way he knew how." Robert was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. Finally, he looked up at Samuel with a question that had been nagging at him all afternoon. "Mr. Thompson, you said you were a professor at the community college. You knew my grandmother for decades. You have all these family documents and photographs. This feels like more than just being a family friend." Samuel smiled, and Robert could see there was still more to the story. "You're very perceptive, Robert. You see, when I was a young man in the 1960s, I was struggling to pay for college. I came from a poor family, and even though I was a good student, I didn't have the money for tuition." He pulled out one more photograph, this one showing a much younger Samuel shaking hands with an older woman. "Your grandmother Ruth found out about my situation and offered me a scholarship. Not just any scholarship, the William and Elizabeth Education Fund, which she had established using money from the original land grants." Robert's eyes widened. "She paid for your education?" "She paid for my undergraduate degree, my master's degree, and my doctorate. When I became a professor, she hired me to teach at the college that your great-grandfather James had built. And when I retired, she asked me to become the guardian of your family's history." The room fell silent again as the full weight of this revelation sank in. Samuel wasn't just a family friend or even a distant relative. He was someone whose entire life had been changed by the Wellington family's legacy of education and opportunity. "So you see," Samuel continued gently, "I owe everything I am to the vision that William and Elizabeth started over 150 years ago. The idea that education should be available to everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances." Lucy tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, does this mean Mr. Samuel is like part of our family?" Robert looked at Samuel, this man who had been entrusted with their family's most precious stories, who had spent his life continuing the work that his ancestors had started. "Yes, sweetheart," Robert said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "I think Mr. Samuel is very much part of our family." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "That means more to me than you could ever know." Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his neighborhood with new eyes. Those houses, those streets, that community center down the road, they all sat on land that had probably once been part of the 1,000 acres that William had accumulated. The life he'd built, the success he'd achieved, it wasn't just because of his own hard work. It was built on a foundation that his ancestors had laid over a century ago. He turned back to his children, who were still poring over the photo album with fascination. "Lucy, Tommy," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "What would you think if I told you that we're going to learn everything we can about William and Elizabeth and everyone else in our family?" "Really?" Tommy's face lit up. "Can we visit the places where they lived? Can we see the schools they built?" Lucy added excitedly. Robert looked at Samuel, who was watching this exchange with obvious joy. "Mr. Samuel," Robert said formally, "would you be willing to be our teacher? To help us learn about our real family history?" Samuel stood up slowly, his old joints creaking, but his smile bright as sunshine. "Robert, it would be the greatest honor of my life." As if on cue, they heard the front door open and the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor. Robert's wife, Catherine, was home from her charity board meeting. "Robert," she called out, "you're home early." How was Singapore? Robert looked around the living room, at the photographs and documents scattered everywhere, at Samuel standing proudly with his leather bag, at his children's excited faces. "Catherine," he called back, "come into the living room. There's someone I'd like you to meet, and we have some incredible family stories to share." As Catherine's footsteps approached, Robert realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. But for the first time in hours, he wasn't scared of that change. He was excited about it. The truth about his family hadn't made him smaller or weaker or less successful. It had made him part of something bigger and more meaningful than he'd ever dreamed possible, and it was just the beginning. Robert's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were sweating, his mouth was dry, and his legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Everything Samuel had just said was swirling around in his head like a tornado. The land, the schools, the college, his grandmother's promise. It was too much to process. But when Samuel looked directly at the doorway and said that the time might be right very soon, Robert knew he couldn't hide anymore. His cover was blown. Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be his last, he stepped out from behind the wall. "Daddy!" Lucy jumped up and ran toward him, her face bright with excitement. "Daddy, you're home early. Mr. Samuel has been telling us the most amazing stories about our family." Tommy scrambled to his feet, too, practically bouncing with energy. "Dad, did you know we had a great-great-grandfather who built schools? And a great-great-grandmother who helped people escape slavery? And that we used to own like 1,000 acres of land?" Robert looked down at his children's eager faces, then up at Samuel, who was watching him with calm, knowing eyes. The old man didn't look surprised at all to see him. In fact, he looked like he'd been expecting this moment. "Hello, Robert," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, just gentle understanding. "I was wondering when you'd join us." Robert's throat felt like sandpaper. "Mr. Thompson," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "What? What exactly do you think you're doing here?" The twins looked back and forth between their father and Samuel, sensing that something had changed in the room. The excitement in their faces started to mix with confusion. Samuel slowly stood up, his movements careful and deliberate. "I'm doing what I promised your grandmother I would do, son. I'm making sure these children know where they come from, where we come from." Robert's voice was getting louder despite his efforts to control it. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know where you got those documents or those photographs, but there's been some kind of mistake." Lucy tugged on her father's sleeve. "What kind of mistake, Daddy?" Robert looked down at his daughter, then at his son, both staring at him with wide, trusting eyes. How could he explain this? How could he tell them that everything they'd just learned might not be true? Or worse, how could he admit that it might be true, but he'd never known any of it? Samuel reached into his leather bag one more time and pulled out something that made Robert's knees buckle. It was a letter, written in handwriting he recognized immediately. His grandmother's careful, flowing script was unmistakable. "Your grandmother Ruth wrote this letter to you, Robert," Samuel said gently. "She gave it to me 3 years ago, just before she passed away. She asked me to give it to you when the time was right." "A letter to me?" Robert's voice came out as barely a whisper. Samuel held out the envelope. Robert could see his own name written on the front in his grandmother's familiar handwriting. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely take it. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Tommy asked, his voice small and worried. "You look scared." Robert sat down heavily on his expensive sofa, still staring at the letter. Samuel gently guided the children to sit beside their father, one on each side. "Sometimes, children," Samuel said kindly, "grown-ups get overwhelmed when they learn new things about their families. It's not scary. It's just a lot to understand all at once." With trembling fingers, Robert opened the envelope. Inside was several pages of his grandmother's handwriting, dated just 6 months before she died. He began to read silently, but Samuel encouraged him to read it out loud. "Dear Robert," he began, his voice shaky, "if Samuel is giving you this letter, it means the time has finally come for you to learn the truth about our family. I know this will be difficult for you to understand, but please read all the way to the end before you make any judgments." Robert paused, looking at his children, who were watching him with concerned faces. "Keep reading." "Daddy," Lucy said softly, "we want to know what Grandma Ruth said." Robert continued, "I have carried the weight of your father's decision for over 40 years. When you were born, your father made me promise never to tell you about William and Elizabeth, about the schools, about any of our real family history. He was convinced that if people knew our family had connections to slavery, even as people who overcame it and built something beautiful, it would hurt your chances in life." The letter went on, and Robert's voice grew stronger as he read. "But Robert, my dear grandson, I never agreed with that decision. I watched you grow up thinking our family's success came from some vague story about European merchants, when the truth is so much more powerful and inspiring." Tommy leaned against his father's arm. "What does that mean, Daddy?" Robert paused in his reading. How could he explain to an 8-year-old that he'd been living a lie his entire life? That everything he'd told them about their family history was wrong? Samuel sat down across from them, his voice gentle. It means, son, that your daddy's father was scared. He was worried that if people knew about William and Elizabeth, they might treat your family differently. But why? Lucy asked, genuinely confused. William and Elizabeth sound like heroes. They were heroes, sweetheart, Samuel agreed. But there was a time when some people had very unfair ideas about anyone connected to slavery, even people like William and Elizabeth who had triumphed over it. Robert continued reading the letter. Samuel Thompson was my student many years ago and later became a dear friend and colleague. He knows our family history better than anyone alive. I have given him all the documents, all the photographs, all the proof of who we really are. Robert, I need you to know that our family's strength doesn't come from hiding our past. It comes from embracing the incredible courage and determination of the people who came before us. The letter went on for several more paragraphs, detailing how Ruth had disagreed with her husband's decision to bury the family history, how she'd watched Robert build his successful business empire while never knowing that he had inherited his entrepreneurial spirit from generations of pioneering educators and community builders. But Daddy, Tommy said when Robert finished reading, if Grandma Ruth knew all this, why didn't she tell us before? Robert looked at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. Because, Robert said slowly, still processing everything himself, she made a promise to my father. And your Grandma Ruth always kept her promises, even when she didn't agree with them, Samuel added quietly. But she also made me promise that if I ever had the opportunity, I would make sure you children learned the truth. Lucy was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her father with serious eyes. Daddy, are you upset that we learned about William and Elizabeth? The question hit Robert like a punch to the chest. Was he upset? He was shocked, confused, overwhelmed, and a little angry at his father for keeping this from him, but upset that his children had learned about ancestors who were brave and accomplished and inspiring. No, sweetheart, he said, surprising himself with how sure he sounded. I'm not upset that you learned about them. I'm trying to understand why I never knew about them myself, Samuel leaned forward. Your father grew up during a very different time, Robert. The 1950s and 60s were complicated years for families with complicated histories. He thought he was protecting you and your future children by simplifying the story. But the story isn't simple, is it? Robert asked, looking at all the documents spread across his coffee table. No, Samuel said with a small smile. It's not simple at all. It's rich and complex and full of people who overcame incredible challenges to build something lasting. People who took the worst circumstances and turned them into opportunities to help others. Tommy picked up one of the photographs of William standing in front of his first school. Mr. Samuel, does this mean we're different than what we thought we were? Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. Son, you're exactly who you've always been. You're still the same smart, curious, kind children you were this morning. The only thing that's different is that now you know more about the people who helped make you possible. Robert was staring at the photograph of the community college, the one where Samuel had taught for decades. You said my grandmother Ruth was your teacher first, then your colleague? That's right. Ruth was the most dedicated educator I ever met. She believed that knowledge and opportunity should be available to everyone, regardless of their background. She lived her great-grandfather William's values every single day. And she never told me any of this, Robert said, more to himself than to anyone else. She wanted to, Samuel said gently. Every time I saw her, she would talk about how much she wished she could share these stories with you and eventually with your children. But she'd made a promise to your father, and breaking that promise would have torn the family apart. Lucy climbed into her father's lap. Daddy, why do you look so sad? Robert wrapped his arms around his daughter, feeling like he was seeing his whole life from a completely different angle. I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about all the questions I wish I could ask Grandma Ruth. Robert stared out the airplane window as the city lights grew larger beneath him. The business trip to Singapore had been a complete success, better than he'd ever imagined. What was supposed to be a week-long negotiation had wrapped up in just 4 days. The biggest tech deal of his career was signed, sealed, and about to make his company millions. He should have been celebrating. Instead, all he could think about was getting home to his family. 3 months of preparation, countless video calls, and 4 intense days of meetings had left him exhausted. All he wanted now was to surprise his wife, Catherine, and their 8-year-old twins, Lucy and Tommy. As the plane touched down, Robert felt that familiar rush of excitement he always got when coming home from a business trip. He'd been traveling for work since before the kids were born, but it never got easier being away from them. This time felt different, though. Maybe it was because the deal had gone so well, or maybe it was because he'd missed Lucy's school play and Tommy's soccer game while he was gone. The taxi ride from the airport took forever, or at least it felt that way. Robert kept checking his phone, looking at the family photos he'd taken before leaving. Lucy, with her wild curly hair that she'd inherited from his grandmother, always asking a million questions about everything. Tommy, with his serious expression and love of building things, constantly creating elaborate structures out of whatever he could find around the house. When the taxi finally pulled into his driveway, Robert felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in days. Home. His beautiful house in the suburbs, with its perfectly manicured lawn and the tire swing he'd hung from the old oak tree last summer. Everything looked exactly the same as when he'd left, which somehow made him feel both relieved and excited. He paid the driver and grabbed his suitcase, practically jogging to the front door. But then he stopped. Catherine's car wasn't in the driveway. That's right. Thursday evening was her charity board meeting. She volunteered with an organization that provided books to underprivileged kids, something she'd been passionate about since college. The meeting usually ran until 8 or 9 o'clock. Robert checked his watch. It was only 6:30. Perfect. He could surprise the twins before Catherine got home, maybe order pizza and have a fun evening together. Mrs. Patterson, their regular babysitter, would probably be happy to leave early. He quietly unlocked the front door, setting his suitcase down gently in the entryway. The house smelled like home, that mixture of Catherine's vanilla candles and whatever cleaning products their housekeeper used. But something was different. Usually when Mrs. Patterson was watching the kids, he could hear the TV blaring cartoons or the sounds of video games. Today the house was strangely quiet. "Hello?" he called out softly, not wanting to startle anyone. "I'm home." No answer. That was odd. Maybe they were upstairs in the playroom or outside in the backyard. Robert walked through the kitchen, noting that someone had made sandwiches earlier. There were crumbs on the counter and a jar of peanut butter left open. Classic Tommy move. That kid could make a mess opening a bag of chips. But as he got closer to the living room, he could hear voices. Not the voices he was expecting, though. Instead of Mrs. Patterson's cheerful chatter or the kids arguing over what show to watch, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was the voice of a man. An older man speaking in low, gentle tones that seemed to command attention. Robert's heart started beating faster. Who was this? Why was there a strange man in his house with his children? His first instinct was panic. All those news stories about break-ins and kidnappings flashed through his mind. But then he heard Lucy's voice, bright and curious, asking questions. And Tommy's laugh, the real one. Not the fake laugh he used when adults told boring jokes. The kids sounded happy, engaged, not scared. Robert crept closer to the living room, staying against the wall so he wouldn't be seen. His mind was racing. Catherine had said Mrs. Patterson would be watching the kids. She'd confirmed it in a text message just yesterday. So who was this man, and where was Mrs. Patterson? As he got closer, he could make out more of the conversation. The man was telling some kind of story, something about history and old times. The kids were asking questions, real questions, the kind they asked when something genuinely interested them. Robert realized he hadn't heard them this engaged in anything for months. He pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through his messages with Catherine. There. A text from yesterday that he must have missed in all the chaos of closing the deal. Mrs. P had family emergency. Found replacement through cleaning service. Kids will be fine. See you Sunday. Robert felt a wave of relief wash over him. Okay, so this wasn't a stranger who had broken into their house. Catherine had arranged for someone else to watch the kids. But she'd said Sunday. He wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday. The replacement babysitter wasn't expecting him back early. Curiosity got the better of his caution. Robert moved closer to the doorway, positioning himself where he could see into the living room without being spotted. What he saw made him stop breathing altogether. The man sitting in his living room was black, probably in his 60s or 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was wearing simple clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt that had seen better days. This definitely wasn't their usual babysitter crowd. Mrs. Patterson was a middle-aged white woman from the neighborhood who had been watching kids for 20 years. But that wasn't what made Robert freeze. It was what the man was showing his children. The coffee table, his expensive glass coffee table that Catherine had special ordered from Italy, was covered with old papers and photographs. Not just any old papers, but documents that looked ancient, yellowed with age and handled with obvious care. The man was holding up what appeared to be a very old photograph, pointing to details and explaining something. That had both kids completely captivated. Robert watched his children, kids who couldn't sit still for a 5-minute conversation at dinner, sitting, cross-legged on the floor with perfect attention. Lucy was leaning forward, her chin resting on her hands, hanging on every word. Tommy was nodding seriously, occasionally raising his hand like he was in school. The living room looked nothing like it had when Robert left for Singapore. The furniture had been rearranged to create a more intimate setting. The formal arrangement that Catherine preferred had been replaced with something that felt more like a classroom or storytelling circle. Even the lighting was different. Instead of the harsh overhead lights, someone had turned on the table lamps, creating a warm, cozy atmosphere. Robert found himself studying the man more carefully. There was something about the way he held himself, the way he spoke to the children, that suggested he was used to being around kids. Not in the casual way of a babysitter, but in the professional way of someone who had spent years teaching or working with young people, and the documents spread across the table. Robert couldn't make out the details from where he was standing, but they looked legitimate, old, important, carefully preserved. This wasn't some random collection of papers. These looked like family heirlooms or historical documents. The man said something that made both kids gasp with excitement. Lucy clapped her hands together, and Tommy actually bounced a little while sitting. Whatever story was being told, it was clearly something extraordinary. Robert realized he was holding his breath. Part of him wanted to march into the room and demand to know who this man was and what he was doing with his children. But another part of him was fascinated. When was the last time he'd seen Lucy and Tommy this engaged with anything that wasn't on a screen? The man reached into what appeared to be an old leather bag beside his chair and pulled out another document. This one made the kids lean in even closer. Robert could see it was some kind of official-looking paper with what might have been signatures at the bottom. Lucy raised her hand, actually raised her hand like she was in school, and asked a question. Robert couldn't quite hear. The man's response was patient and thorough, clearly treating her question with the respect he would give an adult.